So here I am hanging out on my Twitter feed, lurking like I do probably way too much, and all of a sudden I see this. I swear, man, anytime any form of CG appears inside of anime, people seem to think of it as sacrilegious, which in the grand scheme of things isn't a big deal. Usually I just ignore people like that. But people took things way too far this week just because it happened in that anime. Yes, Attack on Titan. Probably, no, I take that back, definitely the most popular anime of the year. And as someone who recently made life-changing decisions involving said anime, see the video linked in the description, I have a personal bone to pick with people who take things this far. So today, before even entertaining the idea that there would ever be any kind of justifiable reason to bully animators who worked on the show, I want to talk about CG in general, and then break down Attack on Titan's use of it and how they actually did a really good damned job with it. Because, ironically enough, this is something I'm actually moderately versed in. But before we start, I do want to specify, I am by no means a specialist in CGI and 3D compositing and 2D animation. I probably know more than most, but I am a hobbyist and by no means an expert, nor do I claim to be. I may get some things wrong, so please take everything I say with a grain of salt. So without further ado, let's talk about an overly complicated subject. First off, we have to establish something pretty simple, but a lot of people still don't really understand. What is CGI? CGI's direct translation is computer-generated imagery. And fun fact, CGI can technically be 2D. You know, a lot of those cookie-cutter anime that all look the same, most of those are created completely in software, making them all completely CGI anime. But they are, in fact, still two-dimensional. However, for the sake of simplicity, for the rest of this video, when I refer to the term CGI, I am strictly referring to 3D CGI, because that is what most people refer to when they say CGI or CG. Basically, for this video, CG is just objects that are created in a 3D program with 3 dimensions, that are usually composited into 2D spaces when talking about anime, but not always, as you're about to see. Speaking of which, while we are talking about compositing, we should also define that word as well, because I'm going to be saying it a lot in this video. Compositing is the act of layering a bunch of elements on top of one another to complete a final image. The elements can be all 3D or 2D or a mix of both, but they do need to be combined to form a singular 2D image, or for our sake, 2D scene. Unfortunately, we have yet to master 3D cinema, although I guess it's actually not too far off. Okay, so now we know what CG is and how it's implemented, so when do we use it? And this is where we enter the opinion zone. A lot of anime purists will tell you that anime should always be 2D, and look, I understand that perspective a bit. But anime is a business, and CG can be an extremely effective tool for saving cost, time, and quality. So let's go over some shows that use CG extremely effectively. The first show I want to talk about that implements CG really well is Ajin. Ajin is a lower budget anime that was released on Netflix by Polygon Pictures, which is an anime studio that works exclusively on 3D anime. This is a pretty clever business strategy because they can consistently churn out low budget anime and make a pretty decent profit. But obviously, if the anime is bad, no one is going to watch it. So what do they do to get people to watch their anime despite the general consensus that CG is bad? Well, they use a few clever tools. Firstly, most of the scenes are composited with very little light. Watching Ajin, you will notice that most of the scenes in this anime are dark and poorly lit. This is fine because it matches the story and increases suspense in the show. However, low light also camouflages the CG better. With bright lights, you can see every inch of the model and notice every little disparity in the character's movement and animation. So the dark scene's primary role is to mask a lot of the small mistakes in the CG animation and quality. The second tool, and frankly the most important, is the story. Ajin is such a deep and terrifying narrative. It's one of those shows that suck you in with mystery after mystery. And when you get pulled into a show's narrative, the art begins to matter less. And Ajin banks on this idea. It's frankly why the show has been so successful despite being entirely CG. The character writing, the villains, and the overall narrative of this show is extremely intense, and once you begin watching the show, it slowly lulls you into forgetting that it is entirely CG. The second show that uses CG to its benefit is Land of the Lustrous. Once again, Land of the Lustrous is another show that is entirely CG. It's made by Studio Orange, who had some experience in compositing CG into 2D animation, but from what I could tell, this was their first step into a fully CG property. Their strategy was a bit different from Ajin's though. First off, the show was cleverly built around the idea of it being a fully CG show. The characters themselves are rigid bodies. They are literally crystals, and as such, awkward body movements don't stand out as much and are easily forgivable. Secondly, the show uses a lot of interesting imagery when working with characters that don't have rigid bodies like the angels. They are mosaic and far from humanoid, so their awkward movements aren't accidents. They are very intentionally meant to look off-putting and unnatural. And finally, the one human character of the show is often shown sitting or moving very little, as to try and keep him looking the most humanoid of all. This show was written around the idea of being CG, and frankly, in my opinion, is probably the most successful fully CG anime to come out thanks to this. So I just looked it up. It was in fact a manga beforehand, but it is a perfect manga for CG adaptation. That's my little 2 cents there, my bad. The final and most promising show that incorporates CG is obviously Demon Slayer. Demon Slayer is a primarily 2D anime that composites CG into its scenes. And look, the CG in Demon Slayer is something else. Studio Ufotable is clearly leagues above everyone else when it comes to cleanly compositing CG inside of 2D animation. A lot of scenes you can't even tell. If every studio could do this, I'm sure they would, but call it a long shot, something tells me the techniques they implement are probably a trade secret exclusive to Studio Ufotable. But there are some techniques we can take note of here. First off, it's clear that Studio Ufotable sticks strictly to animating CG in heavy movement scenes. In other words, using CG Tanjiro in fight scenes almost exclusively. This is an effective strategy because obviously the more movement, the more difficult and time-consuming it is to draw. Whereas with CG, it's only a little more work. Secondly, they also use these large movements with 3D cameras in these scenes. I actually don't know if the idea is to help disguise the CG or not. It's just a pattern I've picked up from Studio Ufotable that may have something to do with how they integrate the CG. By the way, if you have any theories, let me know in the comments because I've literally been sitting here for half an hour trying to break this technique down and explain its purpose. Oh yeah, and I know I already mentioned this earlier, but typically the CG fights are also in low light settings. Now, not anywhere near as dark as Ajin, but maybe just enough to hide any small imperfections. So let's finally move on and talk about how Attack on Titan used CG in the Warhammer fight, and how it took points from all 3 of these shows. So first and most obvious is the plot. Look, I know, crazy rare opinion here, but the plot for Attack on Titan is incredible and really engaging. I don't think many people disagree with me on that one. But yeah, the show has good characters and a strong enough story to carry scenes where the art, and in this case, the CG, should pose less of a distraction since most of us are already heavily invested in the show. Anyway, that was the most obvious one. The second pointer Attack on Titan took from Ajin is low light scenes. Most of the CG that happens in this episode doesn't involve much light. The episode takes place almost entirely at night, therefore helping mask any weaknesses that there may be in the character models or animations. Another thing is that these titans are unnatural creatures that are supposed to look off-putting and, hell, even scary. So, similar to Land of the Lustrous, that actually works in favor of CG. While we're talking about that, these are also heavy action scenes with lots of movement in them, similar to scenes that Studio Ufotable would also opt for CG. And finally, the compositing of CG into the 2D animation is pretty damned good. Sure, in some scenes you can notice it, but just because you can notice the CG doesn't automatically mean it's bad. Bad CG is something that ruins a moment for you, completely taking you out of the show. And if you are really getting to the point where you can't enjoy the Warhammer fight because you can mildly tell that sometimes they use CG to animate the fights, then maybe you should stick to non-action anime, because I got some bad news for you. There will definitely be a lot more CG in the future in this show, because as a manga reader myself, there are other scenes that would work out perfectly with CG compositing. And frankly, a lot of anime need and will be following suit. 2D animation for fight scenes is expensive, and 3D animation is getting ever closer to being indistinguishable from 2D animation. So please, Ufotable, share your trade secrets with everyone already. But no, this is a case of a studio making the right call to properly use CG in their anime and make this fight as awesome as it was. So to see people calling it out as bad just makes me angry, because it's not, and they clearly don't see it for what it is. Now look, before we wrap this video up, I'm not saying all CG is good. I think using it in scenes to fill in the background like ReZero does sometimes is too much. Like, you could just do a simple fill plate with a repeating animation and get a much better and less distracting result. I mean, Astric War's walking mech humans still haunt my dreams to this day. Oh god, and don't even get me started on the CG bear in Golden Kamui. It's like the perfect example of how not to do CG. It's well lit, way too close up, poor compositing, and it all happens at the beginning of the anime way before the story even really starts. But none of these examples I listed are worthy of bullying animators, which at the end of the day is where I draw the line. I know this sounds obvious, but I swear I have a point. Look, in my opinion, the Warhammer fight was incredible, but it's an opinion, and people have different opinions. So if you disagree with me, that's totally fine. But bullying someone online because of your opinion on their work is detestable. This is just inherently wrong, especially considering that at the end of the day, we are just talking about Japanese cartoons. So in my opinion, if you need to bully others who don't agree with your opinion, like say if they use CG in their animation, then get bent. For everyone else, thank you for watching. This was such a fun video to make. You guys, I love talking about something I happen to have some decent knowledge on. Like I said, I am by no means an expert. I'm definitely just a hobbyist. And like I said, if you've ever done real compositing, you know the shit in Demon Slayer is like witchcraft. No one really knows how they do it so good. It is just plain ridiculous. But yeah, Attack on Titan's use of CG was good. They did a fantastic job in my opinion, and frankly, it didn't distract from the fight. I was super invested in it, and the art was pretty good, and they did a good mix. They didn't just do strictly CG. They mixed it really well. Make sure you guys follow me on Twitter, and if you're new here, make sure you subscribe, because YouTube doesn't really show my videos to anyone anymore. And if you're subscribed, please ring that bell. Either way, huge thank you to my patrons. You guys are my heroes. Please make sure you guys stay man and go watch that goddamned anime.